Hello everybody, welcome to number 27, I'm Jack, and this is a Vauxhall VX220 Turbo. Many people will tell you that it was the Elise that saved Lotus. And that is indeed true, but a bit later on, it's actually a Vauxhall, or General Motors, that came to the rescue of the company. This car came to life for a very strange set of circumstances. The Lotus S1 Elise was a great success. But within a few years, Lotus had to make some changes because of new crash regulations. They didn't have the money. General Motors agreed to give them the cash, but in exchange, they had to supply a sports car for one of their marques, Vauxhall or Opel in Europe. This is how the VX220 was born. Also known in Europe as the Opel Speedster, the development process really wasn't all that straightforward. There were quite a few snags. I'm going to tell you about that and also how it compares to the Elise. Let's take it out. Right, so the first thing that will strike you is that this has a little start button, which is not something I am used to from my Elise. Now Derek, who brought me the car, got me the cap as a joke. I'm not going to wear it because I think I look terrible with caps, but just so you saw it, Team Lotus. The wheels also have little Lotus badges, and I think it's quite funny really playing around with the origins of this car. But it is interesting to note that, you know, I don't know what would have happened to Lotus if it wasn't for this. They wouldn't have had the money to develop the new S2, and it worked perfectly for them. Because the natural development for the S2 was to make a car which was more civilized than the first Elise, which was absolutely brilliant, but not the most usable car in the world. I mentioned things didn't go that smoothly, and that is because when Vauxhall executives went to have a look at the factory, Lotus had to upgrade it for production of these. They were supposed to make about 10,000 in all. When they went to have a look at it, one of the senior executives reportedly said that before they could get going, they had to fix the holes in the roof and drive out the chickens. So it gives you an idea of what they thought about Lotus's production values. It is definitely true to say, though, that GM insisted on Lotus implementing automatic torque sensing wrenches and also part tracking, which by then would have been standard in most other places that produced cars, so they were a fair way behind still. Now there's quite a few differences to a standard Elise, but the biggest, most noticeable one is the engine. Let's see how it feels going through the gears, and I'm looking forward to this because I've never driven one of these and it will feel so different to mine. It's a very, very rapid little thing. So many of these, I think most of these, have been modified. It's quite easy to get more power out of them. This one has just got a chip, and that brings the power up from a standard 195 to 235. The VX220 first sold as a naturally aspirated car with 145 horsepower. They were meant to make 10,000, but within the first 3 years, I think they'd sold less than 5,000 and sales were already tapering. So Vauxhall thought they had to do something, which is why the Turbo was made. I think the original car was criticised in comparison to the Elise because it was a bit too soft, a bit too rounded, and the handling was a bit too sanitised. When the Turbo came out, it wasn't just a question of putting a turbo in there. They really re-engineered the suspension as well and made it a much twitchier car. Now this has to be one of the most oddball cars really ever made. If you look at the range and what was Vauxhall and Opel were doing at the time, this didn't really fit in. I think GM wanted a halo car. But what Lotus supplied, based on the Elise, is way too hardcore. This is sanitized, however. They do have ABS. They also have an airbag. the wheelbase is longer. I have heard that that is to increase cabin space. I have to say, this doesn't feel massively more roomy than even my S1 Elise. So Derek, who owns this, was saying that he thought maybe the extra wheelbase was because of the different engine. I'm not sure what the truth of it is, but for sure, this is a more refined car, definitely than an S1. I think to a degree than an S2 as well. The engine is quite torquey. Let's take it up through the gears again, because I absolutely did love that. And for a turbocharged engine, I have to say that this one actually feels much better than you would expect. You can rev it. Right. Oh. It's got an absolutely phenomenal mid-range, but it just carries on pulling all the way to the top. Obviously, this one's got the chip that will help that, but I was expecting to feel a bit less down compared to the K series, because that has a huge appetite for revs. As standard, these don't in quite the same way. But this doesn't feel like a letdown at all. It seems really quite happy to spin up. Oh. Still feels well balanced. It feels less nervous than my S1. 5 to 6,000 is the sweet spot. That's where it seems to pull best. Overall, it feels much better than I was expecting. The only criticism, I suppose, and that's to be expected, is that as a turbo engine, it doesn't do very much low down. Derek was telling me that ordinarily, the turbo would start kicking in around 2.5. On this car, it's about 500 revs later, which doesn't help either, because below that, it really is quite flat. But if you're driving it hard, and you definitely should, it's going to be in the revs and it will pull very, very nicely. The gear change feels okay. They're not always the best on these cars. They're sort of cable driven, and this absolutely does the job. I think perhaps with a couple of mods, maybe some racing cables, if you could, it would make it a little bit slicker. It's got a little bit of stickiness in it. And I'm not sure, compared to certainly an S1 Elise, there's a bit more travel in there. But perhaps the S2's also had a longer gear change than the original car. Brakes are super strong. He's got some sort of tasty compound pads in there, but the discs are the same. It's a very neutral handling thing, and although you have the turbo engine, there's so much grip there that you can go at quite silly speeds in these sort of medium radius corners. It just grips. Front goes a little bit lighter towards the end of the corner, but that's probably because I'm not being brave enough with the throttle. It just, every time you get into one of these cars, whether it's the Elise or this one, they're just so right. The exterior has the same proportions of the Elise, but it looks completely different. I have to say that I think I'd only ever seen one in the flesh briefly a long time ago, and from the pictures, I certainly preferred an S2 Elise, but that's a personal thing. Having seen it now today in the flesh, it looks much better than it does in the pictures, and altogether I do quite like it. I still think I prefer the Elise, but then I think it's just a more rounded car. I prefer the curves to the extreme angles that this has, but this does look very dramatic, and overall I think they succeeded in making it feel different enough. The interior is where it feels most similar to an Elise. Even here they have tried to make a few changes. The sills actually are lower and I think narrower as well. Again, there's that whole theme of making it more livable. I haven't driven a normally aspirated VX220, but I know that these ones, the turbos, did add some extra weight. I think altogether, I'm right in saying it's about 900 kilos. I'm not sure if that's why, but it feels like there's something missing in comparison to the Elise. And I think that is mainly at the front end. From the back, it doesn't feel that dissimilar. I think I still get plenty of feel coming through. The front, by the standards of absolutely any normal car, is perfect. But by the standards of an Elise, it feels a little bit more muffled, like, I don't know, like there's just some invisible layer that is slightly in the way. It doesn't have the full transparency or the sharpness of an Elise helm. I think they made as good a job as they could have of making this feel like a different car, but despite that, the Lotus DNA is present. Now, it's said that these only share 10% of the parts from an Elise, but I think that that's a bit disingenuous. That's supposed to be by volume. So of course, if you take the clams and all that kind of stuff, that's a big load of volumes. They are different. But all in all, you know, when you're in here, you can see, you can feel the way it drives. It isn't like an Elise. It's just a slightly different version. One of the most surprising things for me is how well suited the power plant is. I thought that having a turbo in an Elise derived car would have been a pretty terrible solution, because the lag and also the fact that most turbos from this era tended to peter off towards the top really wouldn't have suited it. But this is so eager to spin up between 5 and 6 that although it doesn't have the crazy 7,000 appetite that the K-Series has, it still works really well. For those that own an S1, you will know how horrible it is to have to take the roof on and off. It's also not weather tight. And I was absolutely gobsmacked to see how good the design for this one is. It is shared with the S2 Elise, although the first versions of that also had some sort of attachment at the back that made it slightly fussier to put on. But compared to what you got in the original Elise, this is an absolute world away. It's so easy, so quick, so convenient. I so wish I had that on my own S1. So what do we make of this really unusual car? I love the history of it. The way it came about is so unusual. And it looks so specific as well. It has the kind of sort of edgy design to try and tie it in with Vauxhall. That front grille, I don't know if that totally suits it for me, but in any case, it's a car that used to be, by the way, an absolute bargain because they were worth so much less than the equivalent Elise. It's still a bargain if you look at power, because this has, as standard, say 200 horsepower, and it would be roughly in the same ballpark as an Elise 135 and S2. But they are not the bargains they used to be, and I think that makes absolute sense. They have just enough distinction and character in them to mean that they work as their own product, and that perhaps they can step out of the shadow of the Lotus. Thank you to Derek for bringing this down today. I've had a lot of fun with it. If you can, please do follow me on Facebook. I'll put a link in the video description and one of the comments, trying to build up that page, so it would be really helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you for the next video.